Talking about political parties, and we're looking at how they play, for better or worse, a vital role in our political system. And so, first, what is a political party? Well, a political party represents a particular group of voters who form an association with common interest, and this allows that group of voters to influence or control decision making within government by electing candidates that represent those broad interests to public office. So that's essentially what a party means. Now, historically, the United States has had a two-party system, with the exception of the years from 1776 until 1800. So during that time, we were single party. There have been a few times where we could be technically multi-party. There was a party known as the Whigs that rose to prominence, actually elected a few presidents, and so we weren't always just two-party, but historically that's been the general story. Okay, so what is a two-party system? Well, a two-party system is a system of government in which you have two parties. Each are competing for power. So the federal system was designed that no one person has all of the power. But now the concern in a two-party system is that currently one party has all of the power, except for the courts. Now, Washington, of course, warned us against the danger of a two-party system. He said it could lead to division, it could even cause civil war. Now, the two-party system emerged from two of our founding fathers, two brilliant minds, both concerned about the future of our country. However, both had strongly different viewpoints on how this country should be organized. For example, Thomas Jefferson supported a limited government. If you look at the preamble of the Constitution, the 6 purposes of government that Jefferson just strongly agreed with, none of them mention a national bank. None of them mention acquiring new territory through purchase or treaty. None of them even mention public roads, public schools, public libraries, public utilities. None of that. Jefferson believed that a government should be only a police and a military. That a government should make laws, it should enforce laws, and it should interpret laws, and otherwise people should be free to live their lives. That was Jefferson's view on government. He was an anti-federalist. He only agreed to the Constitution because the Bill of Rights were included. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton believed that the Constitution could only be protected through a strong national government. After all, he said the Articles of Confederation were a terrible failure that resulted in the near collapse of our country, and a strong national government would be necessary for the survival of our country. So meanwhile, the two could not come to an agreement. They were cordial with one another, they were professional in their interactions, but they disagreed fundamentally with how our country should operate. And in fact, that led to the birth of the two-party system. Thomas Jefferson left the Federalist Party and formed the Democratic Republican Party, and then ran for president against the second president, John Adams. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republican Party, as it was formed by Thomas Jefferson, eventually split up in the election of 1828. In fact, they disagreed over issues of the formation of the National Bank. They disagreed about many of the policies of President Andrew Jackson. And many of the disgruntled Democratic Republicans left because of those two things and formed their own political party called the Whig Party. In fact, within just a few short years, they would run a Whig candidate, William Henry Harrison, and they would win. In that election, there were three parties represented. There was the Democratic Party, represented by Martin Van Buren. There was the Whig Party. Harrison, who won, was an extremely popular figure. And then there was the Federalist Party. Also, the modern-day Republican Party was formed in 1854. It was made up of a bunch of different political parties. There was also third parties even in the 1850s. There was the American Party, nicknamed the Know-Nothings. There was the Free Soil Party. There was the Abolition Party. And, of course, the Whig Party. The modern-day Republican Party was formed by a man named Horace Greeley. But the first Republican candidate ran in 1856. It was the famous General John C. Fremont. He lost to James Buchanan, but the Republicans would win their first presidential election in 1860. The only thing that united the people that became the Republican Party at that time was an opposition to slavery. They disagreed about the details, they disagreed about why slavery should end, but they all agreed that slavery should end. That's what the Republican Party was founded on. That's what it represented, and that's all the South cared about when Lincoln won, because in fact that's when the South seceded. And so we've already talked about whether or not we think that the United States should have a two-party system. So hopefully you have enough to form some type of educated opinion. But now let's talk about third parties, because that is also certainly a thing. Third parties, and let me define that for us, are parties that challenge the two major parties. Are certainly groups that you may identify with and you may even want to get involved with. But what are they? Well, number one is the Populist Party. This is probably the most famous of these. The Populist Party once represented a large group of the nation's poor and downtrodden. Their most famous election was in 1898. The Democratic Party even endorsed the candidate William Jennings Bryan, who was running on the populist platform. His goals included the direct election of senators, which even though they lost this election, that would later become the 17th Amendment. The 8-hour workday, which again, even though they lost this election, would later become federal law. And even better working conditions, and a number of other complex economic issues. And they are the most famous of the third parties, because even though they were always considered a fringe third party, all of their goals eventually came true. And so even though they never won a presidential election, their goals were achieved. Next, there's the Progressive Party. The Progressive Party was formed by Teddy Roosevelt. So it is precedent in this country for a president to serve 2 terms and then retire. Teddy Roosevelt served his 2 terms. He nominated his successor, William Howard Taft, who won election, but Roosevelt was very upset with the legacy that Taft had left. And so he came back, he tried to run again, he formed the Progressive Party. And they also had a number of ideas that, though the Progressive Party never won a presidential election, they all came true. For example, the direct primary. The direct primary means that in 2016, when the Republicans were trying to decide on a candidate and when the Democrats were trying to decide on a candidate, it was up to the people of those particular states to vote on that candidate. It wasn't always that way. Once upon a time, you wouldn't know who any of these people are until the presidential election, because they would be chosen from within the party leadership. So again, even though they didn't win a presidential election, the Progressive Party has had an influence on the way our country works. Secondly, the initiative. The initiative is a fancy word for a petition. If you want to change a rule and your lawmakers going through the proper channels are doing nothing about it, well, that's when you go over their heads. How do you go over the lawmakers' heads? By the people. You have to get a lot of signatures to make it work. More signatures depending on the scale of the project. But that allows the ordinary person to change the rules. And then finally, the referendum. If your initiative is successful, it could result in a referendum being added to the next election ballot. For example, alcohol was legalized in Henderson County and the outside of the city limits because of a referendum. People voted and said, sure, whatever. Referendums have resulted in all manner of significant changes in each state. Some parties are formed and organized based on single issues. Some of these promote a particular social, economic, or moral issue. For example, the Prohibitionist Party. The Prohibitionist Party formed just to outlaw alcohol. That's all they were there for. That's all they could agree on. And that was a big enough deal to these folks to form a political party about it. And of course, it later became the 18th Amendment, known as the Volstead Act. Usually, these types of parties don't last that long because they either achieve their goal or they do not. In the case of the Prohibitionist Party, they achieved their goal, yay, and then they essentially dissolved. There are some parties that form around ideas. These are called ideological parties. They may support a specific set of beliefs or doctrines. For example, there is an American Socialist Labor Party. There is an American Communist Party. And on the opposite extreme, there is a Libertarian Party. These are all parties that run candidates that you can follow and you can keep up with, and they will participate in all of our presidential elections. None of these parties have ever won a presidential election. However, they still remain influential, just like the other ones that we've talked about. Now, third parties often form around independent candidates, meaning that they are often started by a charismatic leader who unites a group of people around a particular cause or idea. The main obstacle to these folks' success is awareness. You all know who ran on the Democratic platform in 2016. I mean, really. You all know who ran on the Republican ticket in 2016. I mean, obviously. Do any of you know who ran for the American Socialist Party? Do any of you know any of the third-party candidates from the last election? Okay. Yeah, Jill Stein ran for the American Democratic Socialist Party, and then who else? Gary Johnson ran for the American Libertarian Party. Did anybody else know that? No, it's okay. It's okay. I know it because, well, I obsessively followed the election. But not many people knew. And yet they were running. They were other options you could have voted for. You didn't have to vote just Tweedledee or Tweedledum. There's always other options. However, the two-party tradition means that the two big parties had more money. You see, you didn't hear a lot about Jill Stein, even though she's brilliant, Gary Johnson, even though he's an extremely accomplished individual. Well, because they didn't have nearly as much money in their war chest as the two big parties did. Now, countries work. I always like to ask this question because sometimes other countries are just better at things than we are, let's be honest. So how do these other countries work? Well, some have a multi-party system. That means that there are more than two viable parties. So that's the trick. That's the real kicker. Is a vote for Gary Johnson, in a backhanded way, in many people's perspective, a vote for Gary Johnson was a vote for Hillary Clinton. In many people's perspective, a vote for Jill Stein was a vote for Donald Trump. Why? Because that's one liberal vote that didn't go to the Democrats. That's one conservative vote that didn't go to the Republicans. And that's why a lot of people don't vote third party. So when I say viable, I mean three actual options with legitimate chances of winning. Gary Johnson never expected to win the office of the President of the United States. He made a name for himself, sure. You can look up about his accomplishments. He has a website, and I'm sure he'll run again next time, or someone will in his stead. Jill Stein, once again, is an amazing and brilliant woman, and she didn't stand a chance, though. She knew she didn't. I mean, these third parties aren't often expecting to win elections, but they're raising awareness for issues that are relevant to the American people. But there are a few countries that have functioning multi-party governments. And I'm not saying that these people have it all figured out. No, they have their problems too. You see, in a multi-party system, there's often never a clear majority. That means a president could win with 30% of the popular vote. And that's kind of scary. This individual who's supposed to represent all Americans only received 1 out of 3 votes. But also, even in the functioning part of the government, it can create an even harder time to get things done. I mean, oh my gosh, if you follow politics, Republicans and Democrats disagree fundamentally on all manner of issues, and it does hinder with the actual functioning of our democracy. Can you imagine if there were 3 groups that never agreed on anything? It would be even harder to get laws passed. So there is a headache that a multi-party system can create too. You see, a multi-party system can even be politically unstable. If there are so many different competing interests, it can be difficult to have a multi-partisan coalition. It's difficult enough to have bipartisan agreement on issues, but multi-partisan, that's even tougher, especially when some of these parties represent some rather extreme ideas. And then finally, Washington's favorite, the one-party system. And I'm not going to tell you this is the best idea either. In fact, I don't know the answer. Well, the trick is that the party and the government are essentially the same. So whoever controls that party, elections are a moot point. You can still have a democratic single-party system, where whoever is running for the head of that party would have to submit to a general election. But if that party has no rivals, then it is assumed that party will remain in power. When Washington ran for his second term, there were no other parties running against him. And so the Federalists essentially controlled the government until the election of 1800. Which is another reason it was so significant when Thomas Jefferson took power. And so third parties do play an important role. They don't always win elections. In fact, they rarely do. I mean, it depends on how you define a third party. So, like the Whigs, William Henry Harrison won. Fun fact: he died 2 months after he won. So he won, though. He was a Whig candidate. And not many others. And I don't even know if you would really call the Whigs a third party. They eventually absorbed into the Republican Party. There have been a few fun cases where third-party candidates won a significant amount of the popular vote. Eugene Debs ran 4 times as an American socialist. He once got 10% of the popular vote while he was in jail. He was in jail for protesting the draft. He said, "I fundamentally disagree with a policy that forces people to go fight for a war they don't believe in." And they threw him in jail for it. He said, "You know what? Nana and boo-boo, I'm going to run for president." And he got 10% of the popular vote while he was there.
How can you run for president from in jail? Is that legal?
He did. Go figure. He's a hero to some. In fact, in Bernie Sanders' office, there's a giant painting of Eugene Debs. So there you go. Okay, so how are these parties different? Well, number one, obviously within our two-party system, you have Republicans, you have Democrats. And they largely differ on the way that government should be involved in the lives of Americans. Democrats tend to believe in more government regulation. I'm going to try to keep this simple. Democrats are generally your big government people. Meaning that, well, the government provided the road out here that got you to school. The government provided the school that we're sitting in right now. Are generally going to favor more government policies. Meanwhile, there are mainstream positions. You see, one thing about the two-party system is they have to appeal to a diverse and divided group of people. Just because you're a Democrat doesn't mean you're going to agree with all of the Democrats on things. Just because you're a Republican doesn't mean you're always going to agree with what the Republicans are up to. But nonetheless, each of these parties has a platform, and you can go to their website and you can read about what they believe in. And a platform is a series of statements that express the party's principles, their beliefs, and their positions on various issues. You know, it's very simple. If you want to Google Republican platform, here's what they believe on different things. You know, it may be even helpful before these representatives come and speak to you to Google their platform. What do they believe on certain things? And honestly, they're going to fall in line with what the Republican Party believes on most things. There's another word you need to understand. It's called plank. And that's not the painful version of a push-up. A plank is each individual's part of a political party's platform. So what is their platform on the plank of abortion? What is their platform on the plank of immigration? Their platform on the plank of the size of the military, etc. And so, in summary, planks and platforms help us understand who we would like to vote for, because once these people have to publish those things, so it shouldn't be a secret of who they're running for.